Gold did not make Spain powerful. It replaced power. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story, and it begins not in a palace or on a battlefield, but on the docks of southern Spain. Imagine Seville at dawn. The river is thick with ships. Hulls sit low in the water, heavy with silver pulled from across the Atlantic. Cranes creak. Bells ring. Officials count and recount crates as crowds gather to witness the arrival of wealth that seems endless. This is not rumor or promise. It is metal. It is weight. It is proof. To the world watching, Spain looks chosen by history itself. Vaults fill. Soldiers are paid. Kings speak with absolute confidence. On paper, this empire appears unbreakable. But beneath that spectacle, something subtle and dangerous is happening. Wealth is arriving faster than judgment can keep up. Decisions no longer feel urgent. Mistakes no longer feel fatal. When gold keeps showing up, consequences can be postponed. Think about that. What happens to discipline when failure is always covered by the next shipment? What happens to strategy when money can erase errors instead of forcing correction? This is where substitution begins. Gold starts standing in for strength. Treasure begins replacing capability. Spain is not building power anymore. It is purchasing the appearance of it. At the center of this story is a simple but devastating shift in behavior. Power used to be something that had to be created. It required systems, skills, and patience. It demanded production, coordination, and restraint. But gold changes the equation. Gold allows the state to skip steps. Armies can be expanded without reform. Wars can be fought without fixing logistics. Consumption can grow without building industry. Each problem finds the same solution. Spend more, borrow more, wait for the next fleet. Easy money does not just finance decisions. It reshapes how decisions are made. Spain's leaders do not wake up one morning and choose weakness. That is not how empires die. They adapt to incentives placed in front of them, and gold creates powerful incentives. When wealth flows in automatically, effort feels less necessary. Planning feels less urgent. Reform feels optional. Why confront inefficiency when silver fills the gaps? Why challenge entrenched interests when money smooths over the damage they cause? Over time, these choices accumulate. The empire grows larger, louder, and more expensive, but not more capable. This is a contrarian thesis that most stories avoid. Spain did not collapse because it lacked resources. It collapsed because resources arrived in a form that discouraged strength. Gold rewired how the empire understood power. Instead of asking how to produce more, it asked how to extract faster. Instead of asking how to build resilience, it asked how to spend tomorrow's wealth today. The state learned to live off inflows rather than foundations. And foundations matter more than income. The stakes of this transformation were enormous. Spain was not a minor kingdom gambling with its future. It was a central power of its age. Its fleets crossed oceans. Its armies marched across Europe. Its influence reached continents. Decisions made in royal chambers shaped the fate of millions. When gold altered how those decisions were made, it did not just affect budgets. It altered history's direction. Each shipment of silver reinforced a dangerous lesson. Problems can be bought away. Imagine the psychology at the top. Advisors present concerns about rising costs, inefficient administration, or overextended forces. The response is not reform, but reassurance. Money is coming. The ships are already on their way. The urgency fades. Over time, this creates a culture where warning signs are tolerated and delays become permanent. Spending replaces planning. Borrowing replaces reform. Power becomes something that can be purchased instead of something that must be built and maintained. This substitution is subtle, but it is lethal. Gold is finite. Discipline is not. Systems can adapt. Shipments can fail. When an empire depends on the arrival of metal rather than the performance of an economy, it places its fate on forces it cannot fully control. Storms do not respect budgets. Mines do not obey expectations. Rivals do not stand still. Yet Spain's system begins to assume continuity. The next fleet becomes a certainty in the mind, even when reality is far less stable. Think about what that does to risk. When future wealth is treated as guaranteed, it can be spent before it arrives. Commitments grow larger. Wars last longer. Expenses multiply. The empire begins to mortgage tomorrow, to pay for today. This is not desperation. It is confidence. And confidence, when detached from reality, is more dangerous than fear. Fear forces adaptation. Confidence delays it. From the outside, Spain still looks strong. That is what makes this story so deceptive. Armies march. Flags fly. Ceremonies continue. Rivals see power, not fragility. But internally, the logic has shifted. The empire is no longer asking whether it can afford its ambitions. It assumes it can. The only question becomes timing. When will the silver arrive? That question replaces deeper ones about sustainability, productivity, and resilience. This is how gold kills power without firing a shot. Not by removing wealth, but by changing behavior. Not by starving the state, but by feeding it the wrong way. Easy money dulls hard choices. It rewards expansion over efficiency. It encourages consumption over creation. Over time, the empire grows dependent on the very thing that made it dominant. Dependence is not strength. It is vulnerability wearing a crown. The danger is not visible in vaults or ceremonies. It hides in habits. It lives in repeated decisions to postpone reform. It shows up in the quiet assumption that tomorrow will look like today. Spain begins to mistake income for capability. But income can vanish. Capability must be built. When that distinction is lost, power becomes fragile, no matter how rich it appears. This chapter is not about decline yet. It is about the moment when the rules quietly change. When gold stops being a tool and starts becoming a substitute. When money no longer supports power, but replaces it. That substitution sits at the center of Spain's story, like a fault line beneath a magnificent city. Everything above it still looks solid. Streets are busy. Buildings stand tall. But pressure is building below the surface. The central question now hangs over the empire like a shadow. What if the very wealth that made Spain feared also made it weak? What if every shipment of silver carried not just money, but a lesson that slowly eroded judgment? What if gold did not strengthen the empire's foundations, but soften them until they could no longer hold? The answers do not arrive all at once. They unfold over decades, hidden behind victories and ceremonies. But the pattern is already set. Power is no longer built patiently. It is rented. And rented power always comes with terms. The story of Spain's fall does not begin with defeat. It begins with abundance, confidence, and the quiet replacement of strength with gold. To the outside world, Spain looked like destiny made real. Silver from across the Atlantic poured into Europe, and Spain stood at the center of that flood. Palaces expanded. Churches rose. Streets filled with foreign goods paid for in bullion. The court glittered with confidence. Soldiers were paid on time. Fleets were repaired, and wars were launched with the certainty that money would follow orders. This was the age of spectacle, and Spain mastered it. Wealth became visible, audible, undeniable. Bells rang when treasure arrived. Ledgers swelled. The empire's power seemed self-evident. But appearances can lie, especially when money arrives fast in understanding. Spain appeared rich because it extracted more than anyone else. That distinction matters. Extraction creates income, but not capability. Production builds strength. Spain leaned heavily on the first and neglected the second. Silver was mined elsewhere, shipped across oceans, and spent almost as quickly as it arrived. It passed through the empire like water through open hands. The state became a conduit rather than a creator of value. Imagine the ports. Ships unloading crates of metal, while ships from rival states arrived to sell finished goods. Tools, textiles, weapons, and luxury items flowed in. Spain paid for them in silver. Why build workshops when you can buy products already made? Why train craftsmen when imports arrive faster? Gold became a shortcut, and shortcuts changed priorities. The empire learned to consume before it learned to produce. This choice reshaped the economy. Domestic industry thinned as imports surged. Local producers struggled to compete with foreign goods backed by more efficient systems. Wages lagged behind prices as inflation crept in. Silver increased the money supply, but it did not increase output. Prices rose quietly at first, then steadily. Yet concern remained muted. After all, the money kept coming. Inflation felt manageable when treasure fleets anchored regularly. Think about the message this sent throughout society. Effort felt optional. Efficiency felt unnecessary. The safest path was not innovation, but access. Those closest to the flow of gold prospered. Those who produced struggled. Over time, talent shifted away from building things and toward managing extraction contracts and court access. The empire's brightest minds followed incentives, and incentives pointed toward silver. The state itself grew accustomed to this rhythm. Budgets expanded. Commitments multiplied. Armies were maintained across distant fronts. Fleets were kept active year after year. Wars became longer, not because they were strategically sound, but because they were financially possible. Gold extended conflicts the same way it extended inefficiency. It delayed endings. It postponed reckoning. From the outside, none of this looked like weakness. Spain's armies marched across Europe. Its flag flew on every ocean. Rivals measured strength in soldiers and ships, and Spain had plenty of both. But beneath that surface was a slow erosion of capability. The empire was paying for power rather than generating it. That difference would matter when conditions changed. Trade deficits were masked by silver inflows. Normally, importing more than you export creates pressure. It forces adjustment. But Spain's treasure blurred those signals. Silver covered imbalances that would have otherwise demanded reform. The economy lost its feedback mechanisms. Warning signs appeared, but they were softened by money. When pain is dulled, learning slows. This is how illusion takes hold. Not through ignorance, but through comfort. Gold created a sense of security that discouraged adaptation. Why endure short-term discomfort for long-term resilience when wealth promises immediate relief? Each time silver solved a problem, it reinforced a belief that it always would. Over time, that belief hardened into policy. The state became large, expensive, and slow. Administration expanded to manage the flow of resources. Layers of bureaucracy formed around distribution rather than production. Costs rose steadily. But again, silver paid the bills. The empire looked busy, powerful, and confident. Few questioned the foundation because the structure still stood. Imagine a grand building supported by hidden beams. As long as the roof holds, no one inspects the supports. Spain's roof was impressive. Ceremonies, victories, and monuments drew attention upward. The beams below quietly weakened. Domestic capacity declined. Skills atrophied. Dependence deepened. Gold also altered expectations. The future was assumed to be rich. Plans were made on the belief that tomorrow's income would resemble today's. Commitment stretched forward, secured by wealth that had not yet arrived. This was not recklessness in the moment. It was optimism institutionalized. And optimism, when embedded into systems, can be dangerous. Inflation continued its slow work. Prices climbed. Fixed income suffered. Social tension grew. Yet these pressures remained manageable as long as silver flowed. The empire learned to tolerate imbalance. Tolerance became habit. Habit became structure. Structure became fragility. Rivals were watching. Some envied Spain's wealth. Others studied its methods. They saw something Spain did not. While silver bought time, it did not buy transformation. Other states invested in shipyards, financial tools, and manufacturing capacity. They built systems that could adapt even when resources fluctuated. Spain relied on certainty in a world that was anything but. The illusion held because consequences were delayed. Delay is powerful. It convinces leaders that their approach works. Each successful year feels like proof. Each avoided crisis feels like validation. But delay is not prevention. It is borrowed time, accumulating interest quietly in the background. This chapter of Spain's story is not about collapse. It is about comfort, about how overwhelming success can blind even capable states. Spain did not fail to see alternatives. It simply had no incentive to pursue them. Gold reduced pressure, and pressure is what forces evolution. Imagine being responsible for an empire where money arrives by ship. The temptation to spend is immense. The risk of restraint feels unnecessary. Reform threatens stability in the short term. Spending preserves it. Gold rewards the present and taxes the future. Spain chose the present again and again. By the time cracks became visible, habits were entrenched. Industries had declined. Skills had faded. The economy had reorganized itself around inflows rather than output. Reversing that path would require sacrifice, discipline, and time. All three were in short supply. From the outside, Spain still looked invincible. That is what makes this moment so important. Illusions are most convincing at their peak. Power feels permanent right before it proves fragile. Gold delayed the lesson, but it did not erase it. Beneath the glittering surface, the empire was becoming less flexible, less productive, and more exposed. This was the height of illusion, the moment when wealth masked weakness so completely that even warning signs looked like temporary inconveniences. The empire stood tall, confident that silver would always arrive, confident that money could always solve problems. But systems built on certainty struggle when uncertainty arrives. And uncertainty was already on its way, carried not by enemies, but by economics. The cracks did not announce themselves with explosions or defeats. They appeared quietly in ledgers, contracts, and delays. Silver kept arriving, but it did not stay. Almost as soon as it touched Spanish soil, it began flowing outward again. Creditors were paid. Foreign suppliers were settled. Bankers collected interest. The metal moved through the empire without strengthening it, like blood that never quite reaches the muscles. Spain looked rich, but it was increasingly cash-poor in practice. This contradiction sat at the heart of the system, hidden behind ceremony and confidence. Inflation did its work steadily. Prices rose faster than wages. Soldiers, workers, and administrators found that their pay bought less each year. The state responded the only way it knew how. It spent more. More silver entered circulation. More costs followed. Domestic producers struggled further. Squeezed between rising prices and competition from imported goods. Production weakened. Dependence deepened. The empire's economy became less resilient with each cycle, even as total wealth appeared immense. As costs outpaced income, the crown turned to borrowing. This was not seen as a crisis at first. It felt reasonable. Future silver shipments were expected. Loans could be repaid when the next fleet arrived. Debt became a bridge between today's expenses and tomorrow's wealth. But bridges, when crossed too often, become roads. Borrowing stopped being an emergency measure and became routine. Power began to run on credit. Think about what that means. Decisions were no longer constrained by current resources. They were constrained by expectations. If leaders believed silver would arrive, they could act as if it already had. Wars were launched. Armies were expanded. Commitments were made, all secured against a future that had not yet happened. Gold had replaced power, and now debt was replacing gold. This is the core mechanism of Spain's decline. Not one bad decision, but a system built on anticipation rather than capacity. When shipment arrived on time, the illusion held. When they did not, the system seized. Storms delayed fleets. Piracy reduced cargo. Mines produced less than expected. Any disruption rippled through the empire. Payments stalled. Wages went unpaid. Confidence cracked. Defaults followed. Not once, but repeatedly. Each default damaged trust. Credit became more expensive. Terms tightened. Lenders demanded higher interest and greater control. Spain still looked powerful, but its options narrowed. The empire that once dictated terms now reacted to them. Financial leverage shifted quietly, without armies or treaties. Imagine the pressure inside the state. Expenses remained high. Obligations could not simply disappear. Armies still needed food and pay. Fleets still required maintenance. Retreat was costly. Reform was disruptive. Borrowing seemed like the least painful option. Each crisis produced the same response: spend faster, borrow more, hope the next fleet arrives. Hope became policy. That is never a good sign. Silver shipments, once seen as guarantees, now fell uncertain. Each arrival brought relief, not confidence. The money went straight to servicing debt rather than strengthening the system. Gold no longer expanded options. It merely prevented collapse. The empire was running in place, expending enormous energy to remain where it was. Meanwhile, rivals adapted. They invested in financial systems that could absorb shocks. They built industries that produced value even when trade slowed. They diversified sources of income. Spain did not. Its structure was too committed, too dependent, too rigid. Gold had delayed adaptation for too long. By the time change became necessary, the cost was overwhelming. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. Spain was rich in appearance and poor in function. It commanded territory, but lacked flexibility. It controlled resources, but not outcomes. The empire's power was impressive, but brittle. Each setback exposed weakness. Each recovery required more borrowing. The cycle tightened. Confidence, once effortless, now required effort. Officials reassured creditors. Reforms were promised, but rarely delivered. Structural change threatened established interests that had grown powerful within the system of extraction and spending. Gold had created winners who benefited from the status quo. Those winners resisted change, even as the empire weakened around them. Think about that dynamic. When wealth flows easily, it creates powerful groups invested in its continuation. Reform threatens them. Delay protects them. Spain's system rewarded those who managed money, not those who built capacity. Over time, that bias shaped policy. Short-term survival consistently won over long-term strength. Each default left scars. Creditors remembered. Terms worsened. Control slipped. Silver that once symbolized dominance now symbolized obligation. The metal no longer represented freedom of action. It represented promises already made. Power had shifted from the flow of gold to the ownership of debt. This shift did not require conquest. It did not require invasion. It happened through contracts and expectations. Spain's rivals did not need to defeat its armies to weaken it. They needed only to wait for the system to exhaust itself. And it was doing exactly that. The turning point was not a single war or a single ruler. It was a moment when gold stopped covering mistakes, when delays turned into shortages, when confidence turned into anxiety, when borrowing no longer bought time, but only postponed consequences briefly. From that moment on, every decision carried weight. There was no easy fix. Cutting spending risked collapse. Continuing to spend deepened dependence. Reform required sacrifice the system could not tolerate. The empire was trapped by its own history of abundance. Imagine standing at the center of such a system. Every option is costly. Every delay makes the future worse. Yet the habits formed during years of easy money remain. Leaders reach for familiar tools, even when those tools no longer work. Gold had trained the empire to expect rescue. Debt had trained it to survive crisis without solving it. This is where fragility becomes visible, not in ruins, but in repetition. The same responses, the same promises, the same hopes. Each cycle weakened the last. Spain was no longer building power. It was managing decline, even if it refused to name it. The empire still looked formidable. It still commanded respect. But respect based on history fades when reality changes. Others sense a shift. Influence moves subtly, then steadily, away from Spain. The center of gravity in Europe began to change, not because Spain vanished, but because others grew stronger while Spain stood still. Gold had once insulated Spain from pressure. Now pressure returned with interest. Every postponed reform came due. Every borrowed solution demanded repayment. The system that had seemed so forgiving revealed its true cost. This chapter is where inevitability begins. Not the inevitability of collapse, but the inevitability of constraint. Choices narrow. Paths close. The empire enters a phase where decline is not dramatic, but persistent. Each year, slightly worse than the last. Each crisis harder to escape. Gold did not disappear. It lost its power to save. And when that happened, Spain faced a reality it had long avoided. Wealth alone is not strength. It never was. And once that lesson arrives, it is usually too late to learn it without pain. Here, in the quiet language of debt and default, the empire's fate becomes clear. Not in defeat, but in exhaustion. Not in poverty, but in dependence. Gold had replaced power. Then debt replaced gold. And nothing remained underneath to hold the weight. Collapse did not arrive with a single disaster. It unfolded slowly, almost politely, over generations. Spain did not fall apart. It thinned. It stretched. It endured longer than many expected, but at a growing cost. The empire remained proud, formal, and ceremonial. Courts still glittered. Titles still mattered. Rituals continued. Yet beneath the surface, influence was shrinking while obligations stayed the same. That imbalance defined the final phase. Spain was carrying the weight of a world it could no longer control. Territory began to slip away, not always through dramatic defeat, but through neglect, resistance, and quiet transfer. Maintaining distant holdings required money, logistics, and credibility. Spain still had money, but less control over it. Logistics were fragile. Credibility had weakened. Each territory loss reduced income but not expenses. The empire became overstretched in a new way, defending old commitments with declining leverage. Creditors now shaped decisions. Terms tightened. Interest consumed revenue. Loans came with conditions, both explicit and implicit. Spain no longer dictated the rhythm of its own finances. It reacted to them. Gold still arrived, but it arrived already spoken for. The metal passed through the empire like a reminder of past dominance rather than a tool of present power. Wealth without freedom is not power. It is obligation. Imagine psychology of decline. Without collapse, there is no moment of clarity, no clean ending. Instead, there's adjustment. Expectations are lowered. Ambitions are trimmed. What once felt temporary becomes permanent. Spain adapted to being less influential, not because it chose to, but because alternatives disappeared. The empire learned to survive within limits it once would have rejected outright. Meanwhile, power moved elsewhere. Not suddenly, but steadily. Influence shifted towards systems that produced value consistently. Productivity mattered more than extraction. Finance mattered more than treasure. Flexibility mattered more than tradition. Spain still mattered, but it no longer set the rules. It played within frameworks shaped by others. This is the quiet end of empire. Not conquest, but displacement. Spain remained present, but no longer central. Its story became a reference point rather than a driving force. Gold, once feared and envied, lost its mystique. It was no longer enough. The aftermath reshaped Europe. Other states learned from Spain's experience, even if Spain itself could not escape it. The lesson was brutal and clear. Wealth that substitutes for capability weakens over time. Easy money builds habits that are hard to break. When abundance replaces discipline, decline becomes a process rather than an event. Think about that legacy. This story is not ancient history locked in archives. It echoes wherever resource wealth replaces investment, wherever income stands in for strength, wherever money delays reform instead of enabling it. The pattern repeats because the incentives are powerful. Gold feels safe. Production feels slow. But only one builds resilience. Spain's experience reveals a hard truth of geoeconomics. Strength is not what you extract. It is what you can sustain. It is the systems you build when money is scarce, not the monuments you raise when it is plentiful. Empires that confuse income with capability eventually lose both. The empire did not drown because the sea ran dry. It drowned because it trusted the tide to do the work of the ship. Gold carried Spain far, but it also carried away from the habits that create lasting power. By the time the tide shifted, the ship could no longer steer. This is why Spain's story endures, not as a tale of bad luck or failed kings, but as a warning written in silver and debt. Wealth is a tool. When it becomes a substitute for judgment, it turns against those who rely on it most. If you want more cinematic stories about how money, power, and economics quietly shape history, subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who still believes wealth alone makes nations strong.